The name is not one of a common criminal, but of a political terrorist who weaponized an ideology to commit an atrocity. This case takes us to the serene landscapes of Scandinavia and into the cold, calculated mind of a man who declared war on his own country. Anders Behring Breivik case, inside the mind of a ruthless Nazi and political activist, true crime. Chapter 1. The Day the Sky Fell. On July 22, 2011, Norway was enjoying the quiet peak of summer. It was a Friday afternoon in Oslo, the air filled with the calm hum of a city winding down for the weekend. In the Regjeringskvartalet, the government quarter, civil servants were finishing their work. 67 kilometers away, on the idyllic island of Utøya, hundreds of teenagers were gathered for the annual summer camp of the Workers' Youth League, AUF, the youth wing of the ruling Labour Party. It was a scene of political idealism, friendship, and youthful optimism, set against the backdrop of a pristine lake and green forests. Norway, a nation celebrated for its peace, prosperity, and social harmony, felt like one of the safest places on earth. This sense of security was about to be obliterated. At 3:25 p.m., a massive explosion tore through the heart of Oslo. A fertilizer bomb, packed into a white van, detonated with unimaginable force, ripping the facades off government buildings, including the office of the Prime Minister. The blast killed 8 people, injured hundreds, and sent a shock wave of terror through the nation. The immediate assumption, echoed by media outlets worldwide, was that this was an act of jihadist terrorism, another front in a global war. But as the smoke cleared in Oslo, the true horror was only just beginning. A little over an hour later, a lone figure dressed in a police uniform arrived at the ferry landing for Utøya Island. He was tall, blonde, and carried himself with an unnerving calm. He told the camp organizers he was there to conduct a security briefing following the attack in Oslo. His name was Anders Behring Breivik. Once on the island, he gathered a group of the young attendees around him, and then he raised his rifle and opened fire. What followed was 72 minutes of methodical, cold-blooded slaughter. This story is not about a moment of madness. It is the story of a meticulously planned, ideologically driven act of political terrorism committed by a single individual against his own people. This case, which became the deadliest attack in Norway since World War II, forced the world to confront a different kind of extremist threat, one that grew not in a distant land, but in the quiet suburbs of a peaceful Western nation. We will journey into the mind of Anders Behring Breivik, a man who saw himself as a soldier in a holy war, to understand how a life of privilege and isolation could curdle into a hatred so profound that it would lead him to massacre the children of his political opponents. Chapter 2. The Architect of Isolation. To understand the man who would later declare himself a Knight Templar at war with multiculturalism, one must first examine the quiet, privileged, yet deeply dysfunctional world that created him. Anders Behring Breivik was born in 1979 in Oslo to a diplomat father and a nurse mother. He grew up in the affluent west end of the city, a world of comfort and opportunity. But the calm exterior of his bourgeois upbringing masked a deeply troubled family life. His parents divorced when he was just 1 year old. His father, a distant and often absent figure, moved to Paris, leaving Anders to be raised by a mother who struggled with her own significant mental health issues. Early child psychology reports, commissioned when Anders was just 4 years old, painted a disturbing picture. Social workers expressed grave concerns about his upbringing, noting his mother's emotional instability and the boy's passive, anxious, and avoidant behavior. One report chillingly suggested he was at risk of developing a more serious pathology and recommended he be removed from his mother's care. This recommendation was never acted upon, and so Anders grew up in an environment of emotional neglect, a home that provided material comfort but lacked genuine warmth or stability. As an adolescent, he made desperate, often clumsy, attempts to find an identity and a sense of belonging. He became involved in the graffiti subculture, a brief and failed rebellion. He was obsessed with his physical appearance, using steroids to build a more masculine physique. He poured his energy into trying to become a successful entrepreneur, starting a series of companies that ultimately failed, leaving him with debt and a profound sense of humiliation. He desperately craved status, wealth, and the admiration of his peers, but he consistently fell short. Each failure pushed him further into a world of fantasy and resentment. He retreated from the real world, which had rejected him, into the digital one. In his late 20s, he moved back in with his mother and spent years living in almost complete isolation, his only significant social interaction taking place through the screen of his computer. It was here, in the echo chambers of the internet, that his personal grievances and narcissistic rage would find a new and terrifying outlet. He was not a product of poverty or oppression. He was a product of privilege, failure, and a soul-crushing isolation that he himself had meticulously constructed. Chapter 3. The Digital Crusader. The isolation of Anders Breivik's bedroom became the crucible for his radicalization. For years, he dedicated himself to an obsessive online odyssey, immersing himself in the burgeoning world of far-right anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic blogs and forums. This was not a passive consumption of information, it was an active process of self-creation. The internet provided him with what the real world never had: a community that validated his feelings of alienation and a grand, overarching ideology that could explain his personal failures. He became a disciple of a conspiratorial worldview, absorbing theories about Eurabia, the idea that European elites were secretly conspiring with Arab nations to Islamize the continent through immigration. He devoured writings about cultural Marxism, a far-right concept that blames a cabal of progressive thinkers for undermining traditional Western values like the nuclear family, Christianity, and national identity. In this narrative, he found the perfect villains for his life story: feminists, liberals, multiculturalists, and the political establishment, particularly the Norwegian Labour Party, which he saw as the primary enablers of this cultural destruction. His personal sense of failure was now transformed into a righteous political crusade. He was no longer just Anders Breivik, the failed businessman living with his mother. He was a patriot, a resistor, a lone warrior who understood the truth while the rest of society slept. This self-aggrandizing fantasy was classic malignant narcissism, but it was now dressed in the armor of political ideology. He began to envision himself as a modern-day Knight Templar, part of a secret order dedicated to defending Europe in a new crusade. This period of intense online immersion culminated in his life's great project, the creation of his manifesto, a sprawling 1,518-page document titled 2083, A European Declaration of Independence. It was a bizarre and rambling compilation of his own writings, interspersed with plagiarized texts from other extremist authors, historical tracts, and even the manifesto of the Unabomber. This document was not just a political text, it was a monument to his own ego, a detailed blueprint for a one-man war. It laid out his ideology, his justifications for violence, and a detailed diary of his preparations for the attack. The digital crusader was now ready to take his war offline. Chapter 4. The Meticulous Preparation. The years leading up to July 22, 2011, were a testament to Anders Breivik's chilling patience, discipline, and meticulous planning. He approached his mission of terror not with the chaotic rage of a madman, but with the cold, calculating logic of a project manager. His life became a singular, focused enterprise, the preparation for the operation. To acquire the materials for his bomb, he established a front company he named Breivik Geofarm. In 2009, he moved to a remote farm in the Norwegian countryside. This provided him with the perfect cover to legally purchase several tons of fertilizer containing ammonium nitrate, the main ingredient for his explosive device. He spent months studying chemistry and bomb-making manuals online, methodically and patiently assembling the weapon that would strike at the heart of Oslo. This was a solitary, painstaking process conducted in the quiet isolation of his rented farmhouse. Simultaneously, he began acquiring his arsenal for the second phase of his attack. He legally obtained a semi-automatic rifle and a Glock pistol by joining a pistol club and going through the required licensing procedures. He purchased a fake police ID and a realistic-looking police uniform online, a key component of his plan to gain access to Utøya Island without arousing suspicion. He understood that deception was as powerful a weapon as any firearm. His preparation was not just logistical, it was physical and psychological. He used anabolic steroids, not just for muscle growth, but, in his own words, to increase his aggression and suppress his fear. He played violent video games like Call of Duty, not for entertainment, but as a form of training simulation to desensitize himself to the act of shooting. He meticulously documented every step of this process in his manifesto, from his budget and schedule to his thoughts and motivations. He was creating a detailed how-to guide for future terrorists, ensuring his legacy would extend beyond the attacks themselves. For over 2 years, he lived a double life, interacting with neighbors and locals while secretly building an arsenal and planning a massacre. The level of long-term, focused dedication was a terrifying hallmark of his pathology. Chapter 5. The Oslo Bombing. On the morning of July 22, 2011, after years of preparation, the project manager of terror put his plan into action. He loaded the nearly 1,000-kilogram fertilizer bomb into a white Volkswagen Crafter van. He put on his police uniform, armed himself, and began the 2-hour drive from his rented farm to the center of Oslo. He was calm, focused, and according to his own writings, listening to uplifting trance music on a loop to maintain a state of controlled aggression. At 3:17 p.m., he parked the van directly in front of the Regjeringskvartalet, the high-rise building that housed the office of the Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg and the Ministry of Justice. He lit the fuse, which had a 7-minute delay. Then he calmly walked away to a second vehicle he had parked nearby and began his journey toward Utøya Island. He was not there to see the detonation. In his grand strategic plan, the Oslo bombing was merely the opening act, a loud and violent diversion designed to draw police resources to the city center, leaving his true target, the next generation of the political elite, vulnerable and exposed. At 3:25 p.m., the bomb exploded. The force of the blast was immense, far greater than anything Oslo had ever experienced. It shattered windows for blocks around and could be heard for miles. The explosion tore a massive crater in the street and ripped through the reinforced concrete of the government buildings, turning offices into twisted landscapes of metal, glass, and paper. A thick plume of grey smoke rose over the city skyline. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Emergency services scrambled to the scene, confronted with a war zone. Survivors, dazed and bleeding, staggered out of the wreckage. The bodies of the 8 victims lay among the debris. The nation and the world watched in horror. The immediate assumption of an attack by an international terrorist group seemed to be confirmed. The Norwegian government was in crisis mode, and the country's security forces were completely focused on the situation in the capital. No one yet knew that the architect of this destruction was already well on his way to his second and far deadlier target. The first part of his plan had worked to perfection. Chapter 6. the massacre on Utøya Island. While Oslo reeled from the bombing, Anders Breivik drove calmly towards the ferry that served Utøya Island. He arrived at the landing around 4:40 p.m., dressed in his police uniform and carrying a crate of equipment. He told the staff he was a police officer sent from Oslo to secure the island and conduct a security drill in the wake of the attack. His uniform and his calm, authoritative demeanor were convincing. He was granted passage. He stepped onto the island around 5:15 p.m. Utøya was a scene of youthful energy and idealism, with over 500 teenagers engaged in political discussions, sports, and socializing. Breivik gathered a group of them near the main building, telling them he had important information about the bombing. They gathered around, trusting the uniform. He then raised his rifle and fired his first shots, killing the camp organizer and an off-duty police officer who was acting as security. What followed was 72 minutes of methodical, relentless slaughter. This was not a chaotic shooting spree. It was a hunt. Breivik moved across the small island with a terrifying efficiency, from the main camp to the woods to the rocky shoreline. He targeted the teenagers systematically, shooting them as they tried to run, hide, or even swim for their lives in the cold lake water. He used hollow-point bullets designed to cause maximum internal damage. He lured some out of hiding by shouting that he was the police and that they were safe. When they emerged, he shot them. The teenagers on the island experienced a level of terror that is almost impossible to comprehend. They were trapped, hunted by a man who looked like a rescuer. They hid under beds, in bushes, and among the rocks. They called their parents in whispered, terrified phone calls, saying their final goodbyes. The island, a symbol of hope for the future of the Norwegian left, was transformed into a landscape of unimaginable horror. Breivik would murder 69 people on Utøya, most of them teenagers. He only surrendered when a heavily armed police tactical unit finally arrived on the island, well over an hour after the shooting began. His mission, in his mind, was complete. Chapter 7. A Nation in Shock. As the full scale of the horror on Utøya became clear, Norway and the world plunged into a state of profound shock and grief. The initial narrative of an international terror attack was replaced by a far more disturbing reality. The perpetrator was one of their own. A white, native-born Norwegian had declared war on his country. The sense of betrayal was as profound as the sense of loss. The days that followed were marked by a nationwide outpouring of grief. Flowers filled the streets of Oslo, turning the area around the city's cathedral into a sea of roses. Vigils were held across the country, with hundreds of thousands of people gathering in silence to mourn the victims and stand in solidarity. The response was not one of anger and calls for vengeance, but one of quiet, resilient unity. The most powerful articulation of this response came from Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, whose own office had been bombed and whose party's youth had been massacred. In a series of speeches that resonated around the world, he rejected the hatred that had fueled the attacks. Our response is more democracy, more openness, and more humanity, he declared, but never naivety. This became the defining mantra of Norway's response. Instead of meeting Breivik's ideology of division and fear with more of the same, the nation chose to reaffirm its core values. This reaction was a complete and utter repudiation of Breivik's goals. In his manifesto, he had written that he hoped his attacks would ignite a violent civil war, that they would polarize society and force people to choose sides. He had hoped to inspire fear and a crackdown on immigration and civil liberties. Instead, he had achieved the exact opposite. He had unified a diverse and sometimes fractious nation in a shared sense of sorrow and a collective commitment to the very openness he despised. He had intended to break the spirit of Norwegian society, but instead he had revealed its strength. The attack was a monstrous act, but as an act of political terrorism, it was a catastrophic failure. Chapter 8. The Trial of a Knight Templar. The trial of Anders Behring Breivik, which began in April 2012, was not primarily about determining his guilt. That was never in question. Instead, it revolved around a single crucial question. Was he sane or insane? This question would dominate the proceedings and become a national debate about the nature of evil, justice, and psychiatric science. From the moment he entered the courtroom on the first day, Breivik made it clear that this was his stage. He raised his arm in a clenched fist salute, a gesture he described as a symbol of his far-right ideology. His primary objective throughout the trial was to be declared legally sane. An insanity verdict, in his view, would have been a fate worse than death, because it would have delegitimized his political message, reducing his meticulously planned terrorist attack to the mere ramblings of a madman. He needed his actions to be seen as political, not pathological. The psychiatric evaluation process was fraught with controversy. An initial court-appointed team concluded that Breivik was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and was psychotic during the attacks, meaning he was legally insane. This finding sparked a public outcry. Many felt it was an unacceptable explanation for such calculated evil. A second evaluation was ordered, and this new team came to the opposite conclusion. They found that Breivik was not psychotic, but suffered from severe narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. This meant he was legally sane and therefore criminally responsible for his actions. During his testimony, which lasted for 5 days, Breivik was calm, arrogant, and utterly devoid of remorse. He spoke in a detached, clinical tone as he described his preparations and the massacres themselves. He described his victims not as human beings, but as traitors who deserved to die for supporting multiculturalism. He read from a prepared statement, lecturing the court on his ideology and presenting himself as a heroic figure. The trial became a surreal and painful spectacle for the survivors and the families of the victims, who were forced to listen to the killer rationalize his monstrous deeds. The court ultimately sided with the second psychiatric report, declaring him sane and sentencing him to the maximum penalty under Norwegian law, 21 years of preventive detention. A sentence that can be extended indefinitely as long as he is deemed a danger to society. Chapter 9. Inside the Narcissist's Mind. To understand the mind of Anders Behring Breivik is to delve into the abyss of malignant narcissism. This is the clinical term that best describes the toxic constellation of his personality traits: pathological narcissism, antisocial behavior, paranoia, and a sadistic lack of empathy. His was not a mind that snapped. It was a mind that had been methodically constructing a grandiose and violent fantasy world for years, a world in which he was the central heroic figure. His pathological narcissism was the engine of his entire being. He possessed a grandiose sense of self-importance, a belief that he was uniquely brilliant and destined for greatness. This was a defense mechanism built to protect a profoundly fragile ego, shattered by years of social rejection and professional failure. When the real world failed to recognize his perceived superiority, he retreated into an online world that did. The extremist ideology he adopted was the perfect vehicle for his narcissism. It transformed him from a failed individual into a savior, a Knight Templar on a historic mission. His antisocial traits manifested in his complete disregard for the lives and rights of others. He viewed his 77 victims not as people, but as symbols, as legitimate targets in his self-declared war. His ability to plan and execute the massacre with such cold, detached efficiency is a hallmark of a profound lack of conscience. He was able to compartmentalize his actions, seeing them not as murder, but as necessary executions. His manifesto, 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, is the ultimate testament to his narcissistic pathology. It is a 118-page monument to himself. While presented as a political document, it is in reality a deeply personal text, an attempt to immortalize his own thoughts, justify his actions, and cast himself as a figure of historical importance. His political beliefs were not the root cause of his violence. They were the language he used to express a pre-existing rage, a profound need for attention, and a desperate desire to be somebody, no matter the cost. His mind was not broken by ideology. He chose an ideology that perfectly fit his broken, narcissistic self. Chapter 10. The Legacy of a Lone Wolf. The legacy of Anders Behring Breivik is a complex and deeply disturbing one. On one hand, his primary political objective was a spectacular failure. He did not ignite a continent-wide civil war. He did not inspire a mass uprising against multiculturalism in Norway. Instead, he provoked a powerful and unified response of solidarity, strengthening the very democratic and open values he sought to destroy. The Norway that emerged from the tragedy of July 22, 2011, was a nation more, not less, committed to its principles of tolerance and inclusion. However, on another, more sinister level, Breivik's legacy has been tragically influential. He became a dark icon, a saint for a new generation of far-right white supremacist terrorists. His meticulously planned lone wolf methodology and his sprawling manifesto became a blueprint for others. The terrorist who carried out the mosque shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, in 2019, explicitly cited Breivik in his own manifesto, acknowledging him as a source of inspiration. Breivik demonstrated how a single individual, fueled by online radicalization and a narcissistic desire for infamy, could inflict mass casualties and terrorize a nation. His case serves as a terrifying case study in the dynamics of modern, internet-fueled extremism. He showed how isolated, aggrieved individuals can find validation, community, and a deadly purpose in the echo chambers of the web. He represents a shift in the landscape of terrorism, away from hierarchical organizations and towards decentralized, self-radicalized actors who are much harder for security services to detect. As we close this file, we are left with the chilling questions that his case forces us to confront. How do we combat an ideology of hate that festers in the anonymous corners of the internet? And how do we identify the warning signs in individuals who are retreating from the world into a private reality of violent fantasy? The case of Anders Behring Breivik is a stark reminder that the most dangerous wars are not always fought on distant battlefields, but in the isolated minds of men who decide to bring their private wars into our shared world. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to explore other true crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them.